Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. We're not starting with a battlefield, or a scandalous royal mistress, or even a suspicious poisoning over a cup of wine. Nope, tonight we're just going to bed. Well, not us specifically. Though if you're listening to this, you probably are in bed, which makes this one of the few history lectures that is fully compatible with falling asleep halfway through. No judgment here. In fact, that's the entire point. So, dim the lights, fluff your pillow, and get comfortable. Because we're going to float gently through the history of how kings and queens, those poor, spoiled, overdressed people at the top of society, used to sleep. And as you might guess, when you're royalty, even going to bed can be an elaborate performance, complete with gossip, politics, and of course, absurd amounts of velvet. Let's ease into it. Royal beds, more stage than bedroom. So, first thing to understand, a royal bed was not really about sleeping. It was about being seen. If you imagine a medieval or early modern monarch just yawning, scratching their head and crawling under the covers, you are very mistaken. For royalty, sleep was a public ritual. The bed was basically a throne you could lie down in. Louis XIV, the famous Sun King of France, had a bed that was less of a bed and more of a sacred stage. Every night, he would perform something called the Grand Coucher, which sounds glamorous, but was really just the highly choreographed version of going to bed in front of an audience. We're talking courtiers crowding into the room to watch the king change into his silk pajamas. High-ranking nobles would actually compete for the honor of handing him his nightshirt. Yes, imagine a duke spending his career hoping one day he might be promoted to royal pajama assistant. That was a thing. And it wasn't just at night. Louis had the petit lever in the morning too, when he woke up, stretched, and let people stare at him again. It was all part of the great royal theater, where the king's body was a piece of political propaganda. Was it comfortable? Probably not. Imagine 30 people standing in your bedroom while you're trying to wind down. But then again, Louis also had one of the fanciest beds ever constructed: gilded wood, embroidered curtains, and a mattress stuffed with enough feathers to depopulate a small farm. So he probably managed. Sleeping with curtains closed. Royal beds were almost always surrounded by heavy curtains, not because they were worried about catching a draft, though that was part of it. Drafts were the great enemy of early modern life, apparently. But the curtains were mostly about privacy, or at least the illusion of it. In big royal palaces, servants, guards, and attendants were always around, always. So, if you wanted a little space, the best you could do was pull your bed curtains and pretend nobody else existed. Henry VIII, for example, loved his massive four-poster beds. Some were so wide that you could sleep sideways and never find the other edge. The curtains were thick enough to block out most of the light, and most of the courtiers trying to eavesdrop. Because remember, sleeping habits could be political too. If the king wasn't sleeping well, everyone wanted to know why. Too much tossing and turning and rumors would spread. Maybe he was ill. Maybe he was stressed about succession. Maybe Anne Boleyn had said something cutting again. So curtains were more than just fabric. They were royal privacy shields. And if you were lucky, they also kept you warm. Spoiler: royal sleep wasn't that good. Here's the fun part. For all the opulence, royal sleep was usually terrible. Take Elizabeth I of England, the Virgin Queen, the great Gloriana, whose portraits always show her as this timeless, glowing figure. In reality, she barely slept. She was a classic insomniac. She would pace her rooms late into the night, anxious about plots, rebellions, or just her endless piles of paperwork. She also insisted on having ladies-in-waiting right outside her chamber at all times, which meant constant noise, constant whispers, and no real chance of drifting off in peace. Catherine the Great of Russia had the opposite problem. She adored sleep, Loved it. But she also had a terrible fear of assassins sneaking in at night, so she rarely stayed in the same bedroom twice. She would rotate through different rooms in her palaces, trying to confuse any would-be killers, which probably confused her servants more than anyone else. Imagine being the maid who had to lug royal bedding from one giant room to another every night just so Catherine could sleep soundly. And then, of course, there's Charles VI of France. Nicknamed Charles the Mad, he sometimes refused to sleep at all, convinced that his body was made of glass and would shatter if he lay down. Which isn't great. Not exactly a restful bedtime routine. Beds as status symbols. The royal obsession with beds wasn't just about comfort. Beds were power statements. Mary, Queen of Scots, famously traveled with her own bed wherever she went. Imagine the royal movers groaning every time she decided to relocate. And when she was imprisoned in England by Elizabeth I, she complained constantly about the lack of proper bedding. For Mary, the bed wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was her symbol of queenly dignity even in captivity. In fact, beds were so important that when royals died, their deathbeds often became relics. Nobles and servants would actually steal pieces of the royal sheets, curtains, or even bits of the mattress stuffing, because nothing says loyal service than running off with a chunk of your boss's pillow. Sleeping with company. Another awkward detail. Monarchs almost never slept alone, not in the modern sense. Sometimes they shared a bed with their spouse, of course, but more often they were surrounded by attendants. Pages, guards, servants, someone was always nearby. In some courts, the highest honor was literally to sleep at the king's feet, not figuratively, actually lying down on a pallet at the end of the royal bed just in case the monarch needed anything during the night. Louis XIV had whole ranks of nobles taking turns on floor mats near his bedchamber, because nothing says power than having an audience while you snore. And this wasn't just the French thing. In medieval England, it was common for even kings to share beds with male courtiers or companions, not necessarily for romance, but for warmth and security. Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, was known to share beds with trusted attendants when traveling. It sounds odd to us, but in a drafty castle with no central heating, doubling up wasn't strange. Strange royal sleep habits. Now, because this is royalty, you know there had to be some truly weird bedtime routines. Take Philip II of Spain, the man who sent the Armada to England and ruled half the known world. He was obsessed with sleeping in small, dark rooms. His palace at El Escorial has a tiny cell-like bedroom right next to the chapel where Philip could literally roll out of bed and attend Mass. The room is so small it feels more like a monk's quarters than a king's bedroom, but Philip loved it. Apparently, conquering empires all day really tired him out. Napoleon, meanwhile, was a famously short sleeper. He bragged about only needing 4 hours a night, which might explain some of his questionable decision-making. Waterloo, for example, was basically fought by a man running on a glorified nap. And then there's Frederick the Great of Prussia. He hated sleeping alone, so he filled his bedroom with greyhounds. Dozens of them. His dogs had their own little velvet beds, but usually ended up crowding into Frederick's. Imagine the smell. But he swore the dogs kept him company and calmed his nerves. The ritual of falling asleep. One of the strangest things about royal sleep is how formalized it was. In France, again, the coucher ritual meant the king's bedtime was a scheduled event. Nobles had to be there at the right time, waiting for their turn to hand the king his slippers or fetch a candle. It could take hours. By the time the whole ceremony wrapped up, the poor king was probably less sleepy than when he started. In Spain, meanwhile, the Habsburg monarchs were famous for sleeping late into the morning. Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, was said to start his day at noon, which sounds decadent, but when you consider the endless paperwork, banquets, and wars he juggled, maybe he just needed the extra hours. Beds in royal gossip. And of course,
No topic about royalty is complete with a little gossip, because royal sleep was not just private, it was political. Who shared a bed with whom? Who stayed overnight in which chamber? Who got invited to the royal entered somewhere? Within his own tie, the royal had no implied any millions of this would never prepare privately. Louis XV was notorious for sneaking mistresses into his private bedchambers despite the official coucher ritual. The courtiers all pretended not to notice, which meant, of course, everyone noticed. In England, rumors about James I's bed companions fueled endless court gossip. He was known for sharing beds with his male favorites, which his critics gleefully turned into accusations of scandal. James, for his part, didn't care much. He liked the company, and if anyone objected, well, he was king. Drifting into history.
So, as you can see, royal sleep was never simple. It was performance, politics, paranoia, and, occasionally, actual rest. Kings and queens treated their beds like thrones, their bedchambers like theaters, and their bedtime routines like ceremonies. Which makes you wonder if they ever really got a good night's sleep. And that's where we'll pause for now. Because as history keeps proving, even bedtime can get complicated when you add crowns, courtiers, and centuries of royal insecurity. But don't worry, we're only getting started. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the world of royal bedrooms, complete with weird night terrors, snoring scandals, and some of the strangest royal sleep accessories you've ever heard of. So settle in. Let's keep floating.
All right, so we left off with the general idea that royal sleep was less peaceful dreaming and more political performance with curtains. Now, let's sink a little deeper under the embroidered blankets and look at the stranger side of things. Because honestly, once you start poking around royal bedrooms, you find an endless supply of odd habits, questionable furniture choices, and some world-class snoring. And yes, of course, even snoring became political. Royal snoring contests. Let's start with perhaps the least glamorous sound imaginable, a king snoring. Henry IV of France, also known as Good King Henry, was apparently a thunderous snorer. So bad that courtiers outside his chambers could hear him through the doors. Imagine trying to have a serious conversation in the hallway while the king is rattling the rafters in the background. But he wasn't alone. Spain's Philip IV was so loud at night that some of his servants genuinely thought he was choking, which, knowing the Habsburg jawline, wasn't entirely impossible. There are records of attendants creeping nervously into his room to make sure he was still alive, which, of course, probably woke him up, and then nobody got any rest. And then you have Napoleon, who reportedly could fall asleep anywhere, in a carriage, on campaign, even in the middle of dictating letters. But once he was out, he would snore so violently that his generals complained. Imagine being trapped in a freezing tent after a long day of marching, only to be serenaded all night by your emperor's nasal trumpet. Nightmares fit for a king. But not every royal sound in the night was snoring. Some of it was screaming. Charles IX of France, yes, the same king responsible for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, suffered from horrific nightmares. He would thrash in bed, cry out, and sometimes leap up in terror. His doctors blamed it on a disturbed humoral balance, which is the medieval way of saying, we have no idea. More likely, it was guilt mixed with a lifetime of bad decisions. Either way, his attendants had the unenviable job of calming him down at 3 in the morning while pretending not to notice the King of France was basically having a meltdown. Over in Russia, Ivan the Terrible also had recurring nightmares. Given his nickname, it's not hard to guess why. He was plagued with visions of demons, enemies, and betrayals. His solution was to switch sleeping quarters constantly, like Catherine the Great after him.
The czars never trusted the dark. And poor George III of Britain, the Mad King, sometimes stayed awake all night, ranting to his attendants. On particularly bad nights, he would burst into song at odd hours or start long, rambling speeches about farming. Imagine being a servant, gently nodding along while your king discusses crop rotation at 4 a.m. You need a nap the next day just to survive his insomnia. The royal bedroom as a mini-court. The thing is, a royal bedroom wasn't really private, not in the way we think of it. If you walked into Versailles during Louis XIV's reign, the king's bedroom was basically a stage set. Courtiers hung around like moths, hoping to catch a glimpse of the royal pajamas, and if you were really lucky, you might get to help pull the covers up, which again was considered a prestigious honor. Even in England, the monarch's bed was part of state business. When James II fled during the Glorious Revolution, one of the first things the new regime did was show off his abandoned bedroom to visiting nobles. It was symbolic, like saying, see, even the bed has changed hands. So when you picture royal sleep, remember, they weren't really alone. They were surrounded, even in bed, by politics, status games, and nosy courtiers pretending not to stare. Beds that traveled the world. Now, let's talk about travel, because kings and queens rarely stayed put, which meant their beds often came along for the ride. In the Middle Ages, monarchs had state beds that were practically mobile palaces. Henry VIII, for example, had an entire portable bedroom set, complete with collapsible four-poster frame, heavy curtains, and feather mattress. Every time he traveled, servants hauled the whole contraption around, setting it up wherever he went, because heaven forbid the king sleep on anything less than his usual cloud of goose down. Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, also traveled with her bed, but in her case, it became a political prop. When she married Philip of Spain, the marriage bed was paraded like a sacred object, embroidered with Tudor roses and Spanish symbols. It wasn't just for sleeping. It was a billboard for dynastic unity. A very awkward, very heavy billboard. Even on campaign, monarchs demanded luxury. Richard the Lionheart had an elaborate bed set up in his tents during the Crusades, with silks. And later, Napoleon, because of course it's Napoleon again, dragged a traveling bed across Europe. His version folded up like a military cot, but still had elegant drapery. Imagine his soldiers huddling on straw mats while their emperor tucked himself into a designer field bed. Sleep accessories, the weird and the useless. Royal bedrooms weren't complete with a range of strange sleep accessories. First up, the warming pan. Because in drafty castles, sheets were freezing cold in winter. Servants would slide a pan of coals under the covers to warm things up before the monarch got in. Convenient? Yes. Safe? Not really. Plenty of beds caught fire this way. Nothing says royal dignity than sprinting out of your burning bedroom in your nightshirt. Then you had the nightcaps, literally, not just the drink. Monarchs wore long, floppy caps to bed to keep warm. Paintings of Charles I and Louis XVI in captivity showed them wearing sad little nightcaps, which somehow make them look even more pitiful. And speaking of drinks, plenty of royals needed a liquid sleep aid. Queen Victoria was partial to a glass of warm milk. Less charmingly, some kings relied on strong wine or brandy. Frederick the Great sometimes downed champagne late at night, which, considering all the dogs in his bed, probably didn't improve the smell of the royal bedroom. Bedtime with the Tudors. Let's zoom in on one dynasty for a moment, the Tudors, because their bedtime routines are just too rich to skip. Henry I, the founder, was paranoid. He kept guards posted outside his chamber at all times, and sometimes even locked himself in with the keys under his pillow, which frankly doesn't scream peaceful sleep. Henry VIII, on the other hand, loved luxury. His beds were so enormous that he often slept diagonally, because why not? He also had the habit of ordering his servants to wake him gently with music or whispered words, which sounds sweet until you remember he also had the habit of executing servants who annoyed him. So, being the king's human alarm clock was a high-risk job. Elizabeth I barely slept at all, as we've said, but she did enjoy lounging in bed for hours in the morning, surrounded by paperwork. Her bed became a sort of office, half sleep, half statecraft. Courtiers would crowd into her bedroom to deliver reports while she sat propped up with cushions, occasionally dozing off. Imagine trying to brief your queen while she nods off mid-sentence. That was Elizabeth's morning routine. Midnight security theater. If you think modern celebrities are paranoid about home security, wait until you hear how royals handled bedtime. The French kings, for example, locked their bedroom doors at night with elaborate rituals. The keys were handed to trusted guards with a level of ceremony usually reserved for crown jewels, because the worst-case scenario wasn't just a burglary. It was assassination. In Russia, the Romanovs often kept entire regiments stationed near their bedrooms. Peter the Great had guards sleeping in the hallway, and sometimes even in the room itself. Catherine the Great rotated her sleeping spots nightly, as we mentioned, just to throw off any potential assassins, which is all very logical, except it probably ruined her sleep hygiene. And then you have poor Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. They slept in separate, very public bedrooms in Versailles, where anyone with the right court rank could watch them go to bed, which didn't help their marriage. In fact, the whole kingdom was gossiping about whether or not the royal couple was, doing their marital duty. Nothing says restful night like a nation speculating about your bedtime activities. When royals didn't sleep at all. Sometimes, of course, they just skipped sleep altogether. Peter the Great of Russia was notorious for pulling all-nighters, either on wild drinking binges or working obsessively on his shipbuilding projects. He once kept his court awake for 3 straight nights on a vodka-fueled spree. By the end, most of his companions were passed out under tables, but Peter was still pacing around, energized, and very, very loud. Philip II of Spain, in contrast, claimed he barely slept because he spent so much time praying. His bedroom at El Escorial had a window straight into the chapel, so he could attend Mass from bed, which sounds holy until you realize it also meant he could hear services at all hours. Peaceful? Probably not. And then there's Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who had insomnia so severe he sometimes just wandered his palace halls at night. His attendants followed him with candles, trailing behind like nervous babysitters. The mightiest emperor in Europe, reduced to pacing around in his slippers at 2 a.m. A kingdom of sleepless royals. So if you're imagining kings and queens tucked up in blissful comfort, sleeping 10 hours on feather mattresses, think again. Most of them were insomniacs, restless, or simply too paranoid to rest. Their beds were symbols. Their bedrooms were political stages, and their sleep, well, let's just say it wasn't much better than yours on a bad night. Maybe worse. At least you don't have to perform a ritual before you can pull up the blanket. And with that, let's drift further into royal dreamland. In the next part, we'll look at some of the most famous and infamous royal deathbeds. Because if regular sleep was complicated, The final sleep of kings and queens came with even more drama. So keep the lights low, keep the pillow soft, and let's keep floating.
All right, so we've tiptoed through royal bedrooms at night. We've listened to the snores, peeked at the dogs in the bed, and watched the awkward rituals of courtiers handing monarchs their nightshirts. Now, let's move to the last and most theatrical form of royal sleep, the deathbed. Because for kings and queens, even dying wasn't private, not even close. Their final nap had to be staged like the ultimate bedtime performance. And yes, of course, it involved way too many people crowding around the bed, pretending they weren't just waiting to see what would happen to the crown. Death as a performance. In the Middle Ages and early modern period, dying was supposed to be a public event. A good monarch was expected to demonstrate piety, composure, and some carefully chosen last words. You didn't just drift off quietly. You put on a show. The king's deathbed was like a live stream of state power before live streams existed. Courtiers, bishops, doctors, and even rival nobles might crowd into the bedchamber, jostling for a view. Everyone wanted to witness the moment when power passed from one body to another. Imagine trying to have a peaceful final nap with 30 people breathing down your neck, scribbling down your last words. Not exactly restful. Louis XIV, the very long goodbye. Louis XIV, the Sun King, as an example. His death in 1715 was basically a drawn-out theater production. He lingered in bed for weeks, surrounded by courtiers and doctors who made every second into a spectacle. Louis, ever the performer, gave long speeches from his pillows, advising his 5-year-old heir on how to rule. He even cracked a few bleak jokes about how much trouble he had caused France, which, honestly, fair. By the time he finally passed, the courtiers were probably exhausted from watching him die in slow motion. It wasn't peaceful, but it was very on brand for a man who turned even sleeping and waking into public ceremonies. Charles II of Spain, a bedside horror show. If Louis XIV was all about theatrics, Charles II of Spain was pure tragedy. Charles, the famously inbred Habsburg, had been sickly his entire life. By the time he reached his deathbed in 1700, his body was basically falling apart. He couldn't eat properly, couldn't sleep, and was plagued with constant pain. Doctors filled his room with every possible cure, bleeding, purging, bizarre potions, even attempts at exorcism. His bedchamber looked more like a haunted apothecary than a peaceful bedroom. When he finally died at just 38, his attendants noted the horrors of his body, which they described in far too much detail. Not exactly a restful eternal sleep, more like a cautionary tale about 200 years of cousin marriage. Elizabeth I, the queen who refused to lie down. Elizabeth's deathbed was unusual, mostly because she refused to use it. In her final weeks in 1603, Elizabeth grew increasingly restless. She stood for hours, leaning against cushions, pacing and refusing to go to bed. She believed lying down would mean surrendering to death, so she just didn't. Her attendants begged her to rest, but she insisted on staying upright until she physically couldn't anymore. When she finally collapsed, she was placed in bed, but by then it was near the end. Her final sleep was brief, stubborn, and thoroughly in character for a queen who had built her entire image on defiance. Louis XV, death with an audience. Louis XV, Louis XIV's grandson, also turned his deathbed into a spectacle, though not as glamorous one. He caught smallpox in 1774, and once word got out, Versailles panicked.
The king's body was covered in sores, and yet the court still crowded into his room. Some came out of duty, others out of morbid curiosity. Attendants had to wave away the stink with perfumed cloths while Louis lay sweating and delirious. The irony: he had once been called Louis the Well-Beloved. By the time of his death, most of France despised him. His bedchamber, filled with nobles choking on incense, was basically the last performance of a king who had overstayed his welcome. Royal last words in bed. Deathbeds were also where monarchs delivered their famous last words. Whether or not they actually said them is another matter. Henry VIII supposedly mumbled something vague about trusting in God. Given his health at the end, morbidly obese, ulcerated, and wheeled around on a mechanical chair, it's likely he didn't manage much of a speech. His attendants probably filled in the blanks for him. Charles II of England, known as the Merry Monarch, apologized on his deathbed for being such a long time a-dying, which is a pretty witty line for a man covered in leeches. And Louis XVIII of France apparently said, "Gentlemen, I am suffering the pangs of the damned," which really sets the mood if you're trying to drift off to eternal sleep. But beyond the words, the bed itself was symbolic. A monarch's deathbed wasn't just furniture. It was the physical site of political transition. Who stood closest to the bed mattered. Who touched the monarch's hand mattered. Who got invited into the chamber mattered. When Charles VI of France was dying in 1422, rival factions in the 100 Years' War jockeyed for position at his bedside. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, stood there too, but mostly to make sure her side got recognized. Charles himself, plagued with mental illness and paranoia, probably had no idea what was going on. But his bedchamber became a miniature battlefield for succession. Similarly, when James II of England was on his deathbed, in exile in France, courtiers of the Bourbon court crowded around to show solidarity with the deposed Stuart king. His actual health was almost beside the point. The symbolism of his bed mattered more than the man lying in it. Weird bedside customs. There were also some deeply odd customs around royal deathbeds. For instance, in medieval France, it was common for nobles to tear pieces of the dead king's bed hangings or sheets as relics, which meant that royal attendants sometimes had to physically fight people off the mattress while the body was still warm. Nothing says dignity than being tugged in 4 directions by souvenir hunters. In Spain, doctors sometimes performed bizarre rituals at the deathbed, like placing holy relics under the pillow or burning herbs around the curtains. Charles II, poor soul, endured a particularly wild mix of superstition and medical torture in his final days. Everything from mercury potions to holy water sprinkled directly onto his sheets. And in England, the ritual of watching the king's body began the moment he died. The corpse was laid out in the bed, dressed in royal robes, and guarded day and night by attendants. Visitors could file in to see the monarch one last time, lying in state as if they had just fallen asleep. The long wait for death. Some monarchs took forever to die, turning their bedrooms into extended waiting rooms for courtiers. Edward VI, Henry VIII's sickly son, lingered for weeks as tuberculosis consumed him. His bedchamber was a grim place, with nobles coming and going, whispering about succession, while the boy king wasted away under heavy covers. Charles VIII of France had the opposite problem. He died suddenly after hitting his head on a doorway. His bed became more of a prop after the fact, where doctors staged their futile attempts to revive him. And then there's poor Louis XIII of France, who spent so long in bed with tuberculosis that courtiers practically set up camp in his bedroom. His final sleep dragged out endlessly, that when he finally went, some nobles were caught off guard, assuming it was just another false alarm. The quiet deaths. Not every royal deathbed was a circus. Some managed quiet exits. Queen Victoria, for example, died peacefully in 1901, surrounded by her family at Osborne House. Of course, by then, the era of public, performative deathbeds was fading. She was attended by doctors and children, not mobs of courtiers. Still, her deathbed was symbolic enough that her youngest son was sent scurrying around with orders like a servant. Even in death, queens gave homework. George VI of Britain, the reluctant king of World War II fame, died quietly in his sleep in 1952. No ceremony, no crowd of nobles, just a modern royal in bed, slipping away in the night. A reminder that by the 20th century, even monarchs were allowed a little privacy. But for most of history, the royal deathbed was never really about the person. It was about the performance. The monarch's body, tucked into pillows and draped in sheets, was the center of attention. Every gesture, every sigh, every muttered word was recorded, interpreted, and sometimes exaggerated. The deathbed was as much a stage as the throne room. And honestly, when you think about it, the royal bed spent as much time staging death as it did sleep. It was the site of nightly performances, marital ceremonies, political gossip, and finally, the last act of kingship. So the next time you picture a royal four-poster bed with silk curtains, don't just imagine the luxury, imagine the tension, the gossip, the relic hunting attendants. Because that wasn't just a bed. It was the setting for centuries of very public, very awkward naps. And with that, we'll ease away from the deathbeds and drift into something lighter for the next part. Because if we've learned anything, it's that even kings and queens couldn't escape the messy politics of bedtime. But in part 4, we'll look at something gentler, the childhood sleep of royal heirs. Spoiled nurseries, tiny canopied cradles, and more than a few tantrums. So stay cozy, stay sleepy, and let's keep floating. So far, we've been drifting around the big royal beds, the four posters, the silk curtains, the grand ceremonies of kings and queens. But tonight, let's make things a little smaller. Let's tiptoe into the royal nursery, where the next generation of monarchs supposedly rested peacefully. Supposedly. Because as you might guess, royal children didn't exactly have quiet, restful childhoods. Their cradles were as political as their parents' beds. Their sleep was monitored, fussed over, and often interrupted by court intrigue, which, in fairness, might explain why so many of them grew up anxious, paranoid, or just plain strange. Cradles of gold and cradles of doom. Let's start with the furniture, because royal cradles were ridiculous. Henry VIII's daughter, Mary, later Bloody Mary, was placed as a baby in a cradle made of gilded wood, padded with fine velvet, and draped in heavy curtains. Imagine an infant sweating under 10 layers of fabric while courtiers cooed about how regal she looked. Louis XIV's nursery contained a cradle carved with suns to match his Sun King brand, because of course it did. Even as a baby, his sleep had to be symbolic. And then there's the cradle of Napoleon's son, the King of Rome. It was an over-the-top monstrosity made of silver, gold, and mother-of-pearl, topped with an imperial eagle. The poor baby probably needed sunglasses just to nap in it. But here's the catch. These glittering cradles weren't actually comfortable. They were more about display than rest. Half the time, the real sleeping happened in plainer cots tucked away from prying eyes, while the golden cradle was wheeled out for show. Wet nurses and rocking sleepless babies. Now, the actual business of getting royal babies to sleep usually fell to wet nurses and attendants. Queens, especially in the later medieval and early modern periods, were rarely the ones rocking the cradle at 2 a.m. That was a job for servants, lots of servants. Mary, Queen of Scots, had her own official rocker, whose only duty was to sit by her cradle and keep it moving until the baby fell asleep. Imagine explaining that as your job title. Yes, I'm professionally employed to wiggle a cradle. In France, the dauphins, heirs to the throne, were assigned entire teams of nurses to monitor their sleep. Too much crying, and doctors were summoned. Too much sleeping, and, well, also doctors were summoned. Basically, anything the royal baby did in the nursery became a medical crisis. Baby kings who never slept. Not all royal children were peaceful sleepers. In fact, some were famously restless. Louis XIII of France, when he was a baby, cried constantly at night. His attendants complained that he never found rest in the cradle. This set the tone for a lifetime of melancholy and anxiety. He grew into a king who chain-smoked, obsessed over rituals, and still never really relaxed. Henry VI of England, who became king as an infant, was another restless sleeper. Chroniclers wrote that as a child, he was fearful of the dark and prone to fits of night terrors. By adulthood, he had full mental breakdowns, possibly linked to the fact that his entire childhood was a parade of stress and sleeplessness. And Charles II of Spain, our old friend, the Habsburg disaster, was said to have screamed himself awake constantly as a baby, which, given his health problems, is not surprising. His cradle time was mostly medical caretaking and whispered prayers that he'd survive long enough to inherit. Spoiler, he did, but just barely. Royal nannies or political spies. The women who managed the royal nursery weren't just babysitters. They were often political players. Anne of Austria, mother of Louis XIV, trusted her children's governesses more than her courtiers, which made sense. These were the people who literally tucked the king into bed at night. But it also meant that nursery staff could become dangerously influential. Whispers made to a sleepy little prince sometimes grew into political preferences later on. In England, there was constant fighting over who got to control the royal nursery. For baby Edward VI, Protestant and Catholic factions tried to install their own nurses, hoping to sway the boy king from his cradle. Imagine two dukes fighting over who gets to change the baby's nightshirt because it might influence the Reformation. That's how high the stakes were. Nightmares in the nursery. Some royal children's night terrors became the stuff of legend. Ivan the Terrible reportedly suffered terrifying dreams as a child, especially after witnessing violent events in the Kremlin. His nursemaids described him waking in the night shrieking, which didn't exactly set him up for a balanced adulthood. Little Louis XIV also had a nervous childhood. During the Fronde Rebellion, when mobs threatened Paris, young Louis was woken in the night and forced to flee the palace in his nightclothes. He never forgot the terror of being dragged from bed by panicked attendants. Later in life, this became part of why he centralized power at Versailles. Because once you've been chased out of bed by an angry mob, you start to take your bedroom security very seriously. Spoiled sleep schedules. On the other side of things, plenty of royal children were too pampered in their sleep routines. Marie Antoinette, as a child in Vienna, had an entire staff to ensure she had the perfect bedtime. Music, warm milk, soft lullabies, all arranged for her. Which meant, of course, that she grew up with zero concept of normal sleep. By the time she was Queen of France, she was still prone to late-night indulgence, lounging in bed until noon. Edward VII of Britain, son of Queen Victoria, was also notoriously spoiled as a child. His nursemaids catered to his every bedtime whim. As an adult, he carried that into his habits, sleeping late, keeping irregular hours, and lounging endlessly in bed with piles of food and newspapers, which honestly sounds relatable, if you ignore the fact that he had entire kitchens delivering to his mattress. The politics of bedtime. It might sound funny, but bedtime was a political act for royal children. Take Louis XV. As a boy, his bedtime routine was attended by factions of nobles arguing over who got to hand him his nightshirt. Courtiers believed that if the king child saw them regularly at bedtime, he'd remember them fondly when he grew up. So yes, people literally jockeyed for power by tucking in an 8-year-old. In England, the same applied to young Edward VI. His bedtime prayers were recited in front of political tutors who carefully shaped his words. Even his lullabies sometimes had political overtones, designed to plant certain religious ideas in his mind. Bedtime was propaganda time. Royal insomnia from the cradle. And of course, plenty of royals carried their childhood sleep problems into adulthood. George III of Britain, who suffered from bouts of madness, was described as a restless sleeper even as a boy. His tutors worried about his nervous energy at night. Later, during his breakdowns, he barely slept for days, rambling endlessly instead. Mary, Queen of Scots, also had a nervous childhood in the nursery. She was often moved around at night for safety reasons: assassination plots, rebellions, political kidnappings. By adulthood, she was jumpy, restless, and frequently anxious at night. Her prison years in England only made it worse. And then, of course, Charles II of Spain again, because why not revisit the worst sleeper in royal history? His childhood insomnia turned into adult paranoia, with whole nights spent awake, muttering prayers or demanding more relics to be placed in his bedchamber. Spoiler, he did, but just barely. Cradles as symbols. Just like the great beds of kings and queens, the cradles of royal heirs weren't just furniture. They were symbols. When a new prince or princess was born, their cradle was often paraded before the court. Ambassadors were invited to see it. Poems were written about it. It was less about the baby's comfort and more about broadcasting dynastic strength. In fact, the cradle was often empty during these displays. The baby was elsewhere, actually trying to sleep, but the golden cradle remained on display as proof that the dynasty had secured its future. Nothing says the succession is safe like an empty velvet crib in a drafty palace hall. Sleep-deprived childhoods, sleep-deprived thrones. So, looking at royal nurseries, a pattern emerges. Too much fuss, too little rest. Either the children were spoiled into unhealthy habits, or they were traumatized by stress and politics before they could even crawl. It's no wonder so many monarchs grew up eccentric, paranoid, or just plain strange. If your earliest memories involve being watched while you sleep, having relics shoved under your cradle, and hearing nobles argue over who gets to hand you your blanket, yeah, you're not starting life with a healthy bedtime routine. And that's where we'll leave the nursery for now. In the next part, we'll drift back to adulthood, into the strange night routines of some lesser-known monarchs, the late-night hobbies, the sleepless wanderings, and even the royal obsession with astrology and dreams. Because bedtime, for kings and queens, was never just about rest. It was about meaning. So fluff the pillow, close the curtains, and let's keep floating.
So far, we've peeked at grand beds, golden cradles, and some very fussy nurseries. Now let's drift into the actual nighttime, those quiet hours when kings and queens, in theory, were supposed to rest. But of course, being royal, they couldn't just go to bed. Oh no, bedtime was wrapped up in ceremony, superstition, and, naturally, politics. Dreams weren't just dreams, they were omens. Night rituals weren't private, they were public performances. And as for actual sleep, well, that came last if it came at all. Court-sanctioned pajama time. Let's start with the royal bedtime rituals itself. In many courts, going to bed was a literal state ceremony. Louis XIV's nightly coucher was essentially a public event. At around 10:30 every night, nobles gathered in his bedchamber to watch the king get undressed. Courtiers fought for the honor of handing him a nightshirt, or, if they were very lucky, taking off one of his shoes. Imagine elbowing your rival for the chance to remove a sock. That's how much prestige was attached to the king's bedtime. The ceremony ended with Louis climbing into bed, curtains drawn, and courtiers bowing their way out. Then, in theory, the Sun King finally got some shut-eye. In practices, he often stayed awake afterward, meeting with close advisors or indulging in late-night chats with mistresses, because when you're Louis XIV, you can bend bedtime rules. England had its own version. The going-to-bed ritual of the Tudor monarchs was formalized enough that specific servants were appointed just to handle the bedclothes.
The groom of the stool may have had the most unfortunate job title, but the gentlemen of the bedchamber weren't far behind. Their role was to manage the sovereign's bedtime, turning down sheets, fluffing pillows, arranging curtains, very dignified. Nightshirts of royalty. Royal sleepwear deserves a little spotlight here, because some monarchs took their bedtime wardrobes very seriously. Charles II of England liked to lounge in lace-trimmed nightshirts, because even in bed, he needed to look rakish. Frederick the Great of Prussia preferred plain nightcaps and simple shirts, which matched his minimalist, grumpy style. Napoleon, ever the oddball, often slept in a military uniform jacket because nothing says sweet dreams like epaulets digging into your neck. Supposedly, he kept his boots nearby too, in case he needed to leap out of bed at a moment's notice. Queen Victoria, meanwhile, was the opposite of glamorous at bedtime. She favored practical cotton nightgowns and heavy wool blankets, which she piled on in ridiculous amounts. Her staff once noted that her bed looked less like a royal resting place and more like a fortress of quilts. Cozy, yes. Regal, not so much. The fear of night air. One theme that pops up again and again is the royal terror of night air. Before germ theory, many Europeans believed that disease was spread by miasmas, bad air, especially at night, which meant that royal bedrooms were often kept tightly sealed. Windows were shut, curtains were drawn, and fireplaces were stoked hot. Louis XV, for instance, insisted on sleeping with all windows locked tight, convinced that open air would kill him. His bedchamber became stifling, which didn't help his already weak health. Catherine de' Medici reportedly went further, ordering herbs burned in her room at night to purify the air. So imagine trying to sleep while the room fills with the smell of scorched rosemary. Relaxing, right? Ironically, these efforts to keep out bad air often made rooms stuffy and unhygienic, basically guaranteeing poor sleep. But hey, at least the miasma stayed out. Late-night obsessions. Many royals were night owls, filling their evenings with obsessive hobbies. Peter the Great of Russia often stayed up tinkering with carpentry projects or ship models. His staff complained that he hammered away late into the night, keeping everyone awake. So if you ever thought your neighbor doing midnight DIY was annoying, imagine it being the Tsar. Frederick the Great of Prussia played the flute for hours before bed. His attendants had to sit through impromptu concerts at midnight, whether they wanted to or not. Apparently, he found it soothing. His staff found it less so. Philip II of Spain, the workaholic king, often stayed up reading and writing until dawn. He micromanaged the empire from his desk, then tried to catch a few hours of sleep in his famously uncomfortable bed. Unsurprisingly, he was perpetually exhausted. Dreams as prophecy. Here's where things get mystical. In the royal imagination, dreams weren't just dreams. They were messages. Ancient kings and queens often had official dream interpreters. The pharaohs of Egypt, for instance, believed that dreams could predict political outcomes. Priests were consulted after particularly vivid visions, as if the night had sent down a memo from the gods. Medieval kings continued the tradition. Charlemagne supposedly dreamed of a giant sword breaking in his hands, which was interpreted as a sign of his empire's future fragmentation. Not exactly soothing bedtime imagery. Henry IV of France once dreamed that his crown was falling from his head. He reportedly woke in cold sweat. Soon after, he was assassinated. Coincidence? Probably. But at court, people whispered that the king had foreseen his fate. And Catherine de' Medici, ever superstitious, kept astrologers close by to analyze her night visions. She treated them almost like state intelligence reports. Imagine filing your dream journal alongside diplomatic memos. Nightmares and guilt. Royal nightmares weren't always about prophecy. Sometimes they were just about guilt. Richard III of England supposedly had recurring nightmares before the Battle of Bosworth. Chroniclers claim he dreamed of being haunted by the ghosts of his enemies. Whether that's true or just Tudor propaganda, it paints the picture of a king whose conscience, or at least his reputation, kept him up at night. Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, was said to suffer restless nights haunted by fears of betrayal and rebellion. Even her physicians noted her sleeplessness, attributing it to troubling humors, which is the 16th century way of saying she's stressed out and can't sleep. Bedtime astrology. Some royals took their nighttime guidance not from dreams, but from the stars. Elizabeth I consulted astrologer John Dee for favorable times to make decisions, including travel, meetings, and, allegedly, even bedtime rituals. Nothing like a little horoscoping to decide when to blow out the candles. In France, Catherine de' Medici again pops up. She loved to schedule her evenings around astrological predictions. She even had an observatory built at the Louvre, partly so she could check the stars before heading to bed. Because why just count sheep when you can chart constellations? Sleep as weakness, sleep as power. For some monarchs, sleep was seen as weakness, something to conquer. Napoleon bragged that he only needed 4 hours a night, which, based on his cranky outbursts and occasional catastrophic decisions, may not have been the best strategy. Still, it made him seem disciplined, almost superhuman. Frederick the Great also cut his nights short, often rising at 4 a.m. He liked to present himself as tireless, working for Prussia around the clock. Sleep to him was for lesser men. But on the flip side, monarchs like Louis XIV used their bed as a stage of power. His coucher ceremony wasn't about sleep, it was about dominance. By making nobles attend his bedtime, he turned even his pajamas into political theater. Sleep wasn't weakness, it was branding. The lonely hours. Despite the ritual, the luxury, and the attendance, many royals confessed to loneliness at night. Queen Victoria, after Prince Albert died, struggled with insomnia. She refused to remove his things from their bedroom and often wrote that she felt haunted by his absence. Nights were the hardest for her. Philip II of Spain, in his later years, spent long nights alone in his monastery palace of El Escorial. He was racked with pain from gout, unable to rest, and his letters reveal endless complaints of sleeplessness. His empire stretched across the world, but his nights were spent pacing, restless, in silence. Even Louis XIV, the most ceremonial sleeper of them all, sometimes confessed to insomnia in his diaries. Behind the golden curtains, even the Sun King occasionally tossed and turned. So what do we see in all these royal night routines? Bedtime was never just private. It was ritual, performance, superstition, or work. Dreams were omens, nightmares were propaganda, and sleep schedules were political statements. Some monarchs avoided sleep to seem powerful. Others drowned in too much ceremony to get any rest. And yet, underneath all the gold nightshirts, astrologers, and ceremonial tuck-ins, there's something very human here. Kings and queens lay awake worrying. They got nightmares. They were lonely. They had insomnia. In short, they were just as bad at sleeping as the rest of us.
So far, we've seen the fancy beds, the ceremonial tuck-ins, the dream interpretations, and the restless royal children. But what about the royals who simply couldn't sleep? Because, unsurprisingly, kings and queens weren't immune to insomnia. In fact, given their stressful jobs, questionable diets, and drafty palaces, it's fair to say a lot of them were chronically sleep-deprived, which in turn meant their doctors had plenty of opportunities to prescribe cures. And, well, let's just say royal sleep medicine was rarely soothing. More often, it was bizarre, unpleasant, or downright dangerous. Medieval sleep potions. Let's start in the Middle Ages. If a royal couldn't sleep, the first recommendation was usually an herbal potion. Sounds innocent enough. Common ingredients included lettuce, hops, lavender, and chamomile. So far, so good. But then the recipes got a little wild. Some medieval sleep draughts mixed in henbane, opium, or mandrake root, all potent narcotics, not exactly bedtime friendly. Henry III of England reportedly took potions laced with opium to calm his nerves at night. Physicians wrote that he needed soothing of the humors, which is a polite way of saying, knock him out before he has another meltdown. Catherine de' Medici, France's famously superstitious queen mother, was rumored to use concoctions of laudanum, that's opium dissolved in alcohol, when she couldn't sleep, which would certainly make you drowsy, though it also guaranteed a nasty hangover the next day. Bedtime foods, another popular cure, was food. Royal physicians often recommended warm milk, honey, or almond drinks before bed.
which doesn't sound too different from modern advice. But they also suggested some less cozy options. Charles V of France was told to eat roasted dormice for supper to promote calm digestion and better sleep. Yes, dormice, the cute little rodents. Apparently nothing says sweet dreams like a plate of toasted mice. Other recipes included mashed poppy seeds mixed into wine, heavy servings of cheese, or even raw egg yolks whipped with sugar, all of which sound like surefire ways to get indigestion, not peaceful slumber. Doctors at the bedside. For royals, insomnia wasn't just a personal inconvenience, it was a state concern. If a king couldn't sleep, his doctors were summoned at once. Philip II of Spain had entire teams of physicians camped out at El Escorial, waiting for his next complaint of sleeplessness. His night routines became case studies in medical records. His Majesty tossed much last night and was troubled by vapors of the stomach, which basically means the king had gas and couldn't sleep. George III of Britain, during his bouts of madness, often went days without rest. His physicians tried every trick in the book, herbal remedies, sedatives, bloodletting, because why not make him weaker? Even cold baths. None of it really worked. Instead, the king wandered the halls at night, rambling to himself, while his doctors scribbled down useless notes. The nightcap. Alcohol as medicine. Of course, the simplest cure, then as now, was alcohol. Royal physicians frequently prescribed wine or brandy as a sleep aid. A small nightcap, they said, would calm the spirits. Sometimes small meant not so small. James I of England was fond of a stiff drink before bed, claiming it steadied his nerves. Queen Victoria also enjoyed a nightly glass of whiskey mixed with hot water and sugar, a proper toddy to ease her into slumber. But heavy drinking before bed had its risks. Charles VI of France, already mentally unstable, was encouraged to drink warm, spiced wine at night. Instead of soothing him, it sometimes worsened his fevers and hallucinations, a bedtime cure that backfired spectacularly. Bedtime baths and other odd ideas. Bathing before bed was another common remedy, but not always in the relaxing sense we imagine. Some physicians recommended cold baths to shock the body into sleep. This often left the poor patient shivering in damp linens, which sounds less like a cure and more like medieval torture. Others preferred scented baths, using herbs like rosemary, sage, or mint. These were poured into warm water, and the monarch was encouraged to soak before bedtime. Catherine de' Medici reportedly loved this method, though, again, it might just have been another excuse for her obsession with herbal magic. And then there were foot baths. Doctors swore that soaking royal feet in hot water before bed drew down the vapors from the brain. Translation, a medieval way of saying, maybe this will relax you enough to fall asleep. Exotic cures for the elite. Because royals had access to resources the average person didn't, their doctors often prescribed exotic ingredients. Louis XIV's doctors recommended powdered pearls and ground gold mixed into drinks as a cure for his insomnia. Did it work? Almost certainly not, but it sounded fancy, and if you're the Sun King, your remedies must sparkle. Empress Maria Theresa of Austria was given saffron and amber infusions as nighttime tonics. These were outrageously expensive, more luxury status than effective medicine. In Russia, Tsar Alexis was treated with bear fat rubbed onto his temples to promote rest, which honestly just sounds greasy. Bedtime superstition. Not all remedies came from physicians. Many monarchs relied on superstitions at bedtime. Charlemagne supposedly kept relics under his pillow for protection. Louis XI of France carried amulets to bed, convinced they would ease his mind. Mary, Queen of Scots, kept rosaries by her bedside and prayed for peace before sleeping. It didn't exactly work, she remained restless and anxious, but it gave her some comfort. Catherine de' Medici, again the queen of superstition, sometimes had astrologers recommend the best nights for sleep. If the stars weren't right, she might stay awake reading or pacing rather than risk unlucky rest. Sleeping drugs and early sedatives. By the 17th and 18th centuries, stronger sedatives were in vogue. Laudanum, opium and alcohol, became the universal cure. Monarchs from France to Britain relied on it. Queen Victoria used it occasionally, as did George III. Physicians described it as soothing the spirits. Modern doctors would describe it as a serious opioid dependency risk. Another common sedative was syrup of poppies, a sweetened extract given at bedtime. Louis XV reportedly took it on restless nights. It was strong enough to knock someone out, but without nasty side effects. The risks of royal sleep medicine. The big problem with all these cures was that they weren't exactly safe. Opium led to dependency, alcohol led to overuse, rich diets and bizarre bedtime snacks made sleep worse, not better, and the endless cycle of treatments left royals sicker and more sleepless than before. Henry VIII, with his endless ailments, constantly demanded remedies for his nightly discomfort. His doctors prescribed everything from strong ale to strange poultices rubbed onto his swollen legs. He slept poorly anyway, tossing and groaning in his oversized bed. Charles II of Spain, of course, had a pharmacy's worth of remedies thrown at him. Sedatives, herbal concoctions, prayers, relics, you name it. None of it helped. His insomnia was legendary, and his doctors were left blaming demons, bad air, and curses. Bedtime as public medicine. One last point here. A royal sleep wasn't private. It was public health business. When Philip II of Spain couldn't sleep, ambassadors were informed because his fatigue affected state decisions. When George III rambled through the night, it became a constitutional crisis. When Louis XIV's insomnia worsened, it was noted in the court gazette, like a weather report. His Majesty rested poorly last night. Which, in other words, the king's sleep patterns were as politically important as military campaigns. A tired monarch was a vulnerable monarch, which is why so much energy went into curing their insomnia, even if the cures were questionable at best. Royal sleeplessness in perspective. So, what do we learn from all this? That kings and queens, for all their gilded beds and velvet curtains, were often just as sleepless as anyone else, maybe more so. Stress, bad medicine, and superstition kept them awake. Their doctors prescribed everything from roasted rodents to powdered pearls. And in the end, most monarchs still tossed and turned. If nothing else, it reminds us that insomnia is a deeply human experience, shared by emperors, queens, and ordinary people alike. The only difference is that the royals had entire teams of physicians and servants hovering over them while they struggled to doze off, which honestly probably made it worse. We floated through gilded cradles, ceremonial tuck-ins, insomnia potions, and all the rest. But eventually, the culture of royal sleep started to change. Kings and queens got tired, literally, of being watched while they put on their pajamas. The bedchamber, once a stage for politics and pageantry, slowly retreated into something more familiar to us, a private space. And with this shift, royal sleep took on a whole new character. The end of the bedtime circus. For centuries, the royal bedroom was essentially a second throne room. Louis XIV perfected the model at Versailles. Nobles crowded around to watch him wake up, eat, and go to bed. But by the 18th century, this was starting to feel a little awkward. Louis XV, unlike his great-grandfather, hated the constant intrusion. He tried to avoid the worst of the coucher ceremony by sneaking off to private apartments within Versailles. There, he could go to bed without 30 people fighting over who got to remove his socks. Revolutionary concept. In England, the same trend was happening. By the Georgian era, monarchs still had grooms of the bedchamber, but the rituals were toned down. George II was famously irritable about court ceremony and preferred to do things his own way, including, apparently, bedtime. It wasn't exactly privacy in the modern sense. There were still attendants, doctors, and servants hovering around, but at least the audience shrank. Slowly, royal beds began to lose their political theater. Bedrooms became apartments. By the 18th and 19th centuries, royals started building private bedroom suites within palaces. At Versailles, hidden corridors allowed kings and queens to slip away from the ceremonial chambers into smaller, cozier rooms. Queen Marie Leszczyńska, wife of Louis XV, was one of the first to insist on more private space. She wanted to live like a normal person, at least when it came to sleeping. In England, Queen Charlotte, wife of George III, set up relatively modest private bedrooms at Buckingham House, the pre-palace version of Buckingham Palace. She preferred simplicity, with comfortable beds, thick curtains, and actual quiet. Shocking. By Queen Victoria's time, the royal family had fully embraced the private bedroom. At Windsor Castle and Osborne House, Victoria and Prince Albert created intimate, family-centered sleeping arrangements. No courtiers needed to watch, just lots of children barging in at inappropriate times, because Victoria and Albert had 9 of them. The death of the ceremonial wake-up. Once the coucher began to fade, the lever, the ceremonial wake-up, soon followed. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette did still have formal morning routines at Versailles, but they were scaled back. And after the French Revolution sent them both to the guillotine, no one was in a hurry to revive those rituals. In Britain, the Hanoverian kings also ditched most of the wake-up theater. George III rose early, quietly, without fanfare. George IV, being George IV, stayed in bed all morning anyway, but it was his own private indulgence, not a state spectacle. By the 19th century, the idea that a king or queen's sleep schedule should be a matter of national importance was fading, which was probably healthy for everyone involved. Sleep, privacy, and modern monarchy. As royal sleep became more private, it also became more ordinary. Queen Victoria set the tone by openly complaining about her own insomnia in letters and diaries. She wrote about sleepless nights after Albert's death, tossing and turning in grief. The point wasn't ceremony, it was personal suffering. For once, a monarch's bed was a human space, not a stage. Edward VII, her son, went further. He loved staying in bed late, eating breakfast in his nightclothes, reading the papers. It was indulgent, yes, but it was also strikingly normal. The king lounged in bed the way a middle-class gentleman might, surrounded by cushions and food trays. George V, Edward's son, was similarly fond of long mornings in bed, smoking cigarettes and reading. By this point, the idea of a courtier handing the king his slippers had faded into history. Royals, like everyone else, could finally get dressed without an audience. The sleep bed as symbol still lingers. That said, even in the modern era, royal beds retain symbolic weight. When Edward VIII abdicated in 1936, much of the British public was scandalized, not just by his love for Wallis Simpson, but by gossip about his lazy habits, his late mornings, his lounging in bed. Newspapers hinted that he was unfit to be king, partly because he treated the monarchy like an extended slumber party. In contrast, Queen Elizabeth II presented herself as disciplined, even Spartan. She kept a steady routine, went to bed early, rose early. No public coucher, no grand wake-up, just quiet regularity. Her sleep habits became part of her carefully cultivated image of duty. Modern sleep problems in the palace. Even without the pageantry, royals still faced sleep troubles. King George VI, Elizabeth II's father, was plagued with anxiety and insomnia, especially during the Second World War. He smoked heavily before bed, which didn't help, and often lay awake worrying. Elizabeth II herself was famously a light sleeper. She kept a bell near her bed to summon staff in the night if needed, and her corgis often shared her bedroom, which may or may not have made things more restful. Prince Charles, now Charles III, has been said to keep a very rigid nighttime routine, with his pajamas pressed fresh every day and his sleep carefully scheduled. He's one of those bed by 11, up at 7 types, which feels very on brand for him. From public sleep to private stress. So, looking back,
the story of royal sleep has shifted from public spectacle to private struggle. Once upon a time, monarchs turned bedtime into theater. Courtiers fought over who got to fluff the royal pillow. Dreams were interpreted as state prophecies. Insomnia was treated with pearls, prayers, and opium. Now, royals mostly go to bed like the rest of us, privately, sometimes anxiously, sometimes indulgently. The rituals are gone, but the sleeplessness remains. Kings and queens may no longer toss and turn under the gaze of 100 courtiers, but they still toss and turn. Because at the end of the day, royalty or not, everyone meets the same challenge: trying to get comfortable, shutting off the worries, and drifting into sleep. And that, gently, brings us to the edge of the modern royal bed. The golden cradles are empty, the ceremonial couches are gone, and the royal night has become just a little more ordinary. Which, if we're honest, might be the biggest relief of all.
So, here we are. We've wandered through centuries of royal beds, some gilded, some drafty, some so stuffed with symbolism they barely felt like beds at all. We started with golden cradles, where royal infants were rocked not just to sleep, but into the expectations of dynasties. We saw kings and queens who couldn't fall asleep without a full audience of courtiers tugging at their bedclothes. We heard about queens who counted pearls instead of sheep, kings who kept entire courts awake with their snoring, and dynasties who thought nothing of turning bedtime into public theater. And now we've arrived in the quiet of modern palaces, where monarchs slip into bed without anyone taking notes, at least most of the time. Sleep as ceremony. For a long time, royal sleep was never really about sleeping. It was about showing power. When Louis XIV let courtiers watch him go to bed, he wasn't giving them a glimpse of vulnerability. He was reminding them that even unconsciousness couldn't dim his authority. Going to bed was another throne, another performance. When a medieval king or queen prayed aloud before sleeping, they weren't just murmuring bedtime prayers. They were broadcasting piety, asking God and everyone in the room to bless their authority through the night. And when courtiers fought for the honor of fetching a slipper or holding the royal candle, they weren't fussing over pajamas. They were staking out political territory. Even sleep, the most human of states, became a battlefield of hierarchy. Beds as thrones. Beds as graves. There's also the darker side. Royal beds were where heirs were conceived, where dynasties were secured, where treaties were forged through marriage. Beds were also where many monarchs died, slowly, publicly, and in full view of those who had the most to gain from their last breath. Think of Louis XIV's endless deathbed ritual. Courtiers filed in to watch him wither, physicians argued over his pulse. Even dying was a kind of coucher, an official ceremony of decline. Sleep and death were often linked in royal imagery. Poets and chroniclers liked to describe death as the eternal sleep. And for monarchs, this metaphor was lived literally. The royal bed was where both nightly rest and final departure took place. So every time a king or queen lay down to sleep, there was that little shadow in the background. The idea that beds were not just for rest, but also for legacy. The fragility of rest. What stands out through all these centuries is how fragile royal sleep really was. The noise of courtiers, the drafts of stone palaces, the stress of dynastic politics, the endless pregnancies demanded of queens, the constant anxiety about war, succession, rebellion. None of this made for peaceful slumber. No wonder so many monarchs complained of insomnia. Henry IV of France tossed and turned. Queen Victoria spent decades unable to sleep properly after Albert's death. Charles VI of France, the so-called Mad King, often drifted into fractured, restless episodes rather than true rest. If anything, their sleep troubles remind us that the crown didn't protect them from the same struggles we face in the small hours.
lying awake, overthinking, wishing for rest. And yet, slowly, things changed. By the 18th century, the audience shrank. Royals began to carve out private rooms within their sprawling palaces. They built corridors that allowed them to slip away unnoticed. They started to value rest not as theater, but as something personal. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert tucked themselves into smaller, family-oriented bedrooms. Edward VII luxuriated in pillows and late breakfasts. George V chain-smoked in bed like any anxious businessman of his time. Elizabeth II, disciplined and methodical, went to bed early and rose early, quietly, without fuss. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't ceremonial. It was simply sleep. And that, I think, is the quiet thread tying all these stories together. Whether in a golden cradle, a Versailles state bed, or a Windsor castle suite, kings and queens always came back to the same fragile need: to rest, to close their eyes, block out the noise, and let go. Royal or not, human beings are bound by the same nightly ritual. We all negotiate with our minds and bodies. We all hope for peace in sleep, and we all occasionally fail to find it. History shows us monarchs trying every trick available: ceremonies, prayers, potions, luxuries, sheer force of will. And still, they were restless. Still, they snored. Still, they dreamed strange dreams and woke up cranky. There's something comforting about that. That beneath the crowns, the jewels, the layers of ritual, royals struggled in the dark the same way we do.
Drifting out of history. So, if you've stayed with me through this long, winding journey, you've essentially just taken a bedtime tour of 1,000 years of royal insomnia. We floated through palaces and castles, past gilded beds and drafty chambers, through nights of ceremony and mornings of groggy kings. And now we're right back where we started, in the quiet. No courtiers, no ceremonies, just the sound of night, the soft weight of a blanket, and the hope that tomorrow will begin a little more rested than today. So, tonight, if you're lying awake, remember, even the Sun King himself had nights where he couldn't drift off. Even the most powerful queen could wake up groggy. Royalty never solved the problem of sleep. They just dressed it up with velvet curtains and gold embroidery. And in the end, they found what we all find. Sometimes the hardest crown to wear is just the weight of your own restless mind. A soft good night. And that's where we'll leave it. The story of royal sleep. Gilded, restless, absurd, and strangely human. Close your eyes, imagine the heavy curtains being drawn shut in some distant palace, the noise of courtiers fading away, the sound of silk and brocade settling into stillness, and the long, slow drift into the kind of sleep that kings and queens chased for centuries, but never quite caught. Thanks for staying with me tonight. Sweet dreams, and may your own bed feel like a throne without the courtiers.
You'd think we'd tucked this story in already. But much like a royal who insisted on a second round of bedtime prayers, or a king who summoned his servants back because he forgot his nightcap, we still have a little more wandering to do. Because the history of royal sleep doesn't end neatly. It drifts. There are side notes, odd habits, half-forgotten details that never quite made it into the main story. Think of this part as the slow fade-out after the lullaby. Sleep accessories, crowns not included. If there was one thing royals loved, it was sleep accessories. Feather beds were common symbols of luxury by the late Middle Ages. Not everyone had them. Peasants often slept on straw or wool sacks. But royals stacked feather mattresses so high you'd need a ladder to climb into bed. Think of Princess and the Pea, but with actual record-keeping to prove the absurdity. Pillows multiplied too.
In inventories from Tudor England, monarchs sometimes had dozens of cushions listed just for a single room. Henry VIII, unsurprisingly, had a pillow obsession. When your daily job includes yelling at courtiers and divorcing queens, maybe you need an extra pillow or two to punch. Blankets were another story. Royals used them not just for warmth, but for symbolism. Some were embroidered with dynastic emblems. Others were lined with ermine or trimmed with gold. A blanket wasn't just a blanket, it was a statement piece. And then there were beds as gifts. Monarchs exchanged entire beds with each other. Marriage alliances often included grand bedsteads, carved, gilded, and shipped across borders. Because nothing says welcome to the family like a four-poster the size of a carriage house. Pets in the bedchamber. One detail we brushed past earlier, pets. Royals rarely slept alone, and not just because of courtiers. Dogs and cats especially were constant bedroom companions. Mary, Queen of Scots, had a small dog that famously stayed hidden in her skirts during her execution, but before that, it had been a loyal bedroom companion. Queen Elizabeth I loved her lapdog so much that her courtiers complained about the smell in her chambers. Not very regal, but very relatable. Queen Victoria allowed her spaniels to sleep near her bed, and later, of course, Elizabeth II had her corgis. It's hard to picture the grandeur of Buckingham Palace when you remember the monarch was probably tripping over tiny dogs on the way to the bathroom at 2 a.m. Sleepless politics. Sleep, or the lack of it, occasionally caused actual political problems. Take Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. He suffered from chronic insomnia, especially later in life. His restless nights fueled his irritability, which in turn made him snap at his advisors. Chronic bad temper in a ruler wasn't exactly stabilizing for an empire spanning half of Europe. Or consider George III, whose bouts of mental illness often manifested in sleeplessness. He could go days without proper rest, pacing, talking endlessly, exhausting everyone around him. For courtiers, the king's insomnia became their insomnia because they were required to attend him. Sleep deprivation, in other words, was contagious in a royal court. And then there's Napoleon. Not technically a king, but he might as well had been. He was notorious for surviving on very little sleep, 4 or 5 hours a night at best. Admirers painted this as genius discipline. Critics pointed out that cranky, overtired emperors don't always make the best decisions. Sleep and superstition. We've touched on dreams as prophecy, but there's more to it. In some courts, sleep positions were considered meaningful. Sleeping on your back was thought to encourage visions. Sleeping on your left side was unlucky. Royals sometimes took advice on which way to face in bed, as if rotating 90 degrees might secure better dreams. There were also superstitions about who slept in the bed. Shared beds were common for warmth, but in royal settings, they also signaled alliance. Two noblemen sleeping in the same bed didn't necessarily imply anything romantic, it was often a show of trust. Monarchs themselves sometimes shared beds with favored courtiers or heirs, partly as bonding, partly as political statement. Of course, over time, these practices faded, leaving historians to puzzle over bed-sharing arrangements without jumping to conclusions. But the fact remains, royal sleep wasn't always solitary. Travel sleep. And then there's the question of sleeping on the move. Monarchs rarely stayed put. They traveled between castles, palaces, hunting lodges, and sleep during travel was often rough. Carriages weren't exactly ergonomic. Ships could be dangerous. Temporary lodgings might be drafty or flea-ridden. Even kings had to endure lumpy travel beds and the occasional rat in the rafters. Henry VIII complained bitterly about uncomfortable travel accommodations. Louis XIV avoided traveling as much as possible, partly because he disliked sleeping anywhere less magnificent than Versailles. The mobile royal court was glamorous in theory, but in practice it often meant restless nights. Deathbeds again. We already touched on royal deathbeds, but they deserve one more sleepy glance. Because the royal deathbed was often the ultimate inversion of private rest. Where modern people die quietly in hospitals or at home, monarchs died surrounded. Attendants, heirs, rivals, clerics, physicians. Sometimes dozens of people packed into the bedchamber. The dying monarch might be half conscious,
but the room would be buzzing with politics. Who would succeed? Who had the monarch's last blessing? Which courtiers would be rewarded or punished? For some kings, death dragged on for weeks, turning the bed into a literal stage. For others, like Henry II of France, it was more sudden. A jousting accident left him dying in bed with courtiers already scheming around him. Beds were never just beds. They were thrones, cradles, stages, and graves. The long echo. So why does this matter? Why spend hours wandering through the sleeping habits of monarchs? Because sleep is where power becomes fragile. In waking life, kings and queens wore crowns, gave orders, built empires, but in bed, they were vulnerable. They could be snoring, dreaming nonsense, or just lying awake like the rest of us. And for centuries, people gathered to watch that vulnerability, to make meaning of it, to wrestle it into ceremony. Even now, when monarchs sleep privately, their beds still carry echoes of history. The symbolism lingers. We imagine Queen Elizabeth II tucked in with her corgis, Charles III fussing over his pressed pajamas, and we know those aren't just beds. They're extensions of dynastic image, quiet ones, but still present. A final drift. And so, in this extra stretch of the story, we've skimmed the smaller details, the pillows, the pets, the travel beds, the sleepless emperors, the leftovers that didn't quite fit into the main tale, but still hum quietly in the background. If the earlier chapters were the bedtime story, this is the drowsy conversation that happens afterwards, when the lights are out, but you're still awake, mumbling thoughts in the dark. The history of royal sleep doesn't end. It just stretches on, night after night, century after century. Always fragile, always a little absurd, and always reminding us that even those who wore crowns had to close their eyes eventually. So let's leave them there, tossing, turning, dreaming, snoring, monarchs, queens, emperors, and all their courtiers, drifting in and out of restless history. And with that, we can finally say good night.
We've wandered through cradle and coffin, canopy and curtain, candlelight and courtiers. And now we've finally reached the last watch at the royal bedside. The story of royal sleep has been long, maybe even too long, but that's the point. Sleep stories are supposed to stretch out, to circle back, to lull instead of excite. So let's end not with noise, but with silence. Repetition as rest. Think back to where we began. Golden cradles for royal infants, velvet beds for monarchs who needed their authority embroidered into the sheets, courtiers crowding around for the coucher and the lever. Think of the ceremonies, the whispered prayers, the endless layers of bedclothes. Think of the kings who snored so loudly the whole palace knew it, the queens who never really rested because they were expected to bear heirs, the dynasties that measured their future in sleepless nights. We've said it before, but here at the end, it bears repeating. Royalty slept differently, yes, but they also didn't. They shared the same restless tossing, the same moments of fragile calm, the same half-remembered dreams. The bed as a stage. Everywhere we looked, the bed was never just a bed. It was a throne, a bargaining table, a prayer book, a tomb. Royal children were rocked in beds that symbolized dynastic hope. Royal couples were expected to prove their fertility in beds that everyone else somehow cared about. And royal elders often died in those same four-posters, surrounded by heirs waiting like vultures. The bed was the one place where monarchy showed both its most private and its most public faces. The slow drift into normalcy. And then slowly, things quieted down. The court rituals faded, the curtains drew heavier, the courtiers were sent away, kings and queens closed their doors, and for the first time in centuries, actually had bedrooms that belonged to them and no one else. By the 19th and 20th centuries, sleep became something private, something not staged, not ceremonial, not written into law. Victoria mourned in sleepless grief, Edward VII lounged in late mornings, Elizabeth II tucked in early, methodical as always, Charles III fusses over routine.
No velvet rope separates their rest from ours anymore, at least in principle. Why it matters at all. So why spend all this time tracing the sleeping habits of monarchs? Because sleep is the place where even the most powerful people are vulnerable, where crowns slip away, where titles don't matter, where breathing evens out and eyes close. It's also where anxieties creep in, where insomnia gnaws, where a restless body betrays a restless mind. And that was as true for emperors and queens as it is for anyone listening right now. Sleep equalizes. It reduces pomp and ceremony to something soft, fragile, human. The echo of curtains closing. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The heavy drape of brocade curtains sliding shut, the murmur of attendants leaving the chamber, the sound of slippers fading down a corridor, and then stillness. A royal bed in some drafty castle, a monarch shifting, sighing, finally still. The echo of centuries of this ritual, grand or humble, public or private, lingers in the quiet. And it tells us the same story over and over, that no matter the crown, no matter the empire, every night ends with a body lying down, searching for rest. For you, listening now. And that brings us back to you, sitting, or more likely lying, in your own bed. You've just listened to hours of history that, if we're honest, was mostly about people trying and failing to sleep, which feels appropriate, because that's the story of sleep itself, everyone chasing it, nobody quite mastering it. If you're still awake, that's fine. Royals spent entire lives sleepless. If you're drowsy, let that drift carry you. If you're already gone, then you've joined the long tradition of people who finally found rest in the middle of a too long bedtime story. The very last good night. So let's end where all these monarchs ended every night, with the quiet hope of rest. No more ceremonies, no more courtiers, no more embroidered blankets. Just the silence of a room, the weight of night, and the soft rhythm of breathing. Close your eyes. Imagine those centuries of royal beds fading away, the golden cradles, the velvet canopies, the gilded four-posters, all dissolving into shadow. And in their place, just you. Your own bed, your own moment of rest. Good night to kings. Good night to queens. Good night to dynasties and their restless heirs. Good night to all the courtiers and attendants who never got enough sleep either. And good night to you. May your sleep be easier than theirs.